Okay, welcome back for the second part of this biopsychological topic. Make sure to keep following along with that activity. In this video, I'll be just talking about some functions of other hormones and how these hormones influence certain motivations. The three main motivations we'll be hitting on here are just first of all, the motivation to act aggressively, and then I'll talk about hormones for sexual motivation, and then we'll finish up with um, a hormone that influences hunger motivation. So, the first one to hit on here, a really well-known hormone is testosterone, and this is known to have an influence on aggression and dominance. So high testosterone is associated with increases in aggression. And this is especially the case with adolescent males. And so with this population, especially an increase in testosterone is often accompanied by increases in aggressive behavior. Also, kind of on the flip side, so not only does testosterone influence aggression, but aggression and success in dominance contests also influence testosterone levels. So aggression in these and success in these scenarios can raise those testosterone levels. And just to mention a couple of systems that we talked about in the last video. So the Rett response or the PAC system, that's just another way. There's a couple ways to say the HPA. So it's just PAC, HPA, same thing. So threat response leads to a decrease in testosterone versus the challenge response, and that SAM system leads to activation of that leads to increases in testosterone. All right, I want to go through and just talk about a study here that included measures of blood pressure, cortisol, and testosterone. So basically what they did in this study was they measured personality style, and then they split that into two different categories of personality, one being those who are generally high in hostility and have more of a hostile personality versus those who are lower in trait or personality hostility. And then in the study, they had participants do an anagram task, which can be a bit frustrating sometimes. And basically, if you don't know what an anagram task is, that's just when there are scrambled up words. And so the job of the participants was to unscramble those to find the actual words. And then they also manipulated how the experimenter acted. So the experimenter was either acting as an experimenter normally would and was polite. But in the other condition, the experimenter was rude, and this was the harassment condition. And then finally, for this slide, we're talking about blood pressure. So blood pressure is measured during and after that anagram task. And so what we see here is, in general, during the task, those who have the high hostile personalities had higher blood pressure during the task, especially in that harassment condition. And you see the same thing after the task with the in the harassment condition only, though. This in the no harassment condition returns to pretty much a baseline. And so we see that both the personality as well as the condition matter in determining what the individual's blood pressure was. Now getting into a couple of these hormones. So first is cortisol. Again, we see that those with the high hostility personalities displayed higher cortisol levels during the task. Additionally, with cortisol, that's especially the case for after the task where hostility really matters, especially in that harassment condition. And this makes sense based on just what we talked about in the last video, right? With cortisol, in terms of the process that leads to cortisol being pretty slow. And so oftentimes, again, cortisol will peak about 15 minutes after whatever that stressor is, whenever that occurs. So yeah. Finally, we have testosterone here, which again is consistently associated with things like aggression and hostility. And we see this is relatively similar to that blood pressure, where those with the high hostility personality traits displayed much higher levels of testosterone than those with the low hostility personalities. And that's especially in the case in the harassment condition. So that harassment seems to have definitely an effect, especially on those with the high personality, hostile personalities. And then this starts to return after the task. And so we see that testosterone is a bit more of a, I guess, quick system in terms of relative to cortisol, that is. And so at least in for those with the high hostile personalities, that begins to decrease. Those levels decrease after the task relative to during. However, that's interestingly not the case for the low hostile group there. All right, so I want to talk about some sexual motivations and sexual orientation here. And so there's quite a bit of research that's gone into this, and it pretty consistently shows that various hormones are certainly involved in sex motivation. And although the development of sexual orientation is not completely understood, it's still definitely, debated consistently, especially politically and all that. But from the standpoint of this class and from some various empirical research studies that have looked at this, what they have found is that social factors appear to play a very, very small role in the development of sexual orientation, whereas some of those biological factors play a much larger role. And so one of those biological factors is hormones. And so research has shown that perinatal exposure to testosterone and estradiol seem to program a preference for female partners. And then, yeah, so additionally here for just sexual motivation, it seems relatively clear for men which hormone influences this. So testosterone will influence those sexual motivation levels for men. It's a bit more complicated, however, for women. And so that's why it seems as though estrogen influences the sexual motivation of women, but that's it's not a definitely. And so with women, sexual motivation does seem to be to some extent timed to the ovarian cycle. And so sexual motivation and initiation is the highest during the ovulatory phase, as we see in this chart here. Sorry, I guess I'm blocking the top, but that's the key there. And so in the last topic, right, with the sociobiological stuff, we talked about evolutionary standpoints. And from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense in terms of sexual motivation being the highest when the likelihood of fertility is also the highest. All right. So there are also some situational constraints when it comes to sexual motivation. And so obviously there are, things like social norms that will influence sexual motivation. Like it's not socially okay or normal to be going around having sex whenever, wherever you'd like during each day. And so that's where we end up with this chart here. And so one of these situational constraints appears to be the days of the week. And so as you can see, percentage of weekly intercourse is um, rising for the weekend and peaks on Sundays. The idea is that there's a lot of stress during the work week, and just in general, there's less time. And so sexual motivation on those days is typically lower. All right, this is the slide that we will finish up with. Just want to briefly talk about leptin and hunger. Um, yeah. Leptin is produced by fat cells and inhibits food intake. So in other words, it downregulates hunger. It's a natural bodily way of downregulating hunger and just in general regulating how much we eat. And so this is images from an individual who is leptin deficient. And so these are some before and after pictures. And so before, with that leptin deficiency, there's no natural way to inhibit hunger. And so you just see those who are leptin deficient continually just eating and eating and eating. And however, for the after this leptin treatment, the food intake was then influenced by that. And so once that leptin treatment takes place, it goes to work for regulating that hunger and how much one eats. And that then in turn, influences things like weight, as we see here. All right, that's it for the second video. And hopefully you kept up with the activity. I think part 3 was the part of that activity that fits for this video. And then we'll continue on with the next one where we will talk about neurotransmitters and brain structures.